The supper plate had gone cold by the time Margaret Townsend said the words aloud, and she said them to no one, because there was no one left to hear them. "I have not had supper worth remembering until this evening." She sat at the long oak table her father had hauled across 3 states, a table built for a family of 8, and she was the only soul in the house. The words fell into the silence of the kitchen like stones dropped into a dry well. Outside, the wind was doing what it always did across the Texas panhandle in October of 1878, pushing hard against the clapboard walls, testing every nail, every joint, every commitment the house had ever made to standing upright. The candle on the table guttered. The stew in her bowl steamed faintly, and Margaret stared at it with an expression that had nothing to do with hunger. The stew was remarkable. That was the problem. It was the most remarkable thing she had eaten in 3 years of eating alone, and it had been made by a stranger's hands. His hands. She pushed back from the table abruptly, the chair legs scraping against the pine floor with a sound like a cry, and she pressed both palms flat on the table and stood there, leaning over the bowl, breathing slowly. Her dark hair had come loose from its pin at the nape of her neck. Her calico dress was dusty at the hem from a full day's work. She was 28 years old, and she was the sole owner of the Townsend Ranch, 3,000 acres of hardscrabble grazing land with a creek that ran thin in summer and a herd of 212 longhorn cattle, and she had not asked for any of this, and she had not asked for him either. Emmett Hadley was asleep in her barn. She had told him he could stay one night. She had said it plainly, without invitation in her voice, because she was a woman who had learned to keep invitation out of her voice, the way a careful man learns to keep his gun in its holster. One night only, and in the morning he would move on, and she would go back to eating supper alone and not thinking about it. But he had made the stew. She had not asked him to do that either. She pulled out the chair again and sat back down because the stew was hot and her body was tired, and she was not a woman who wasted food. She picked up her spoon and took another mouthful, and the warmth of it spread through her chest and settled somewhere low behind her ribs, and she said the words again, quieter this time, almost a confession. "I have not had supper worth remembering until this evening." And that terrified her more than anything had in a very long time. 3 weeks before that cold October night, Margaret Townsend had been doing what she did every morning before the sun broke the flat line of the horizon. She was moving. A body in motion does not have time to think about what it has lost, and Margaret was very good at staying in motion. She was in the south pasture at 4:30 in the morning, walking the fence line with a lantern, checking for breaks where the Beaumont brothers' cattle had been pushing through for the better part of a month. The Beaumont brothers were her nearest neighbors, 12 miles southwest, and they were the kind of men who believed that a woman alone on 3,000 acres represented an opportunity rather than a fact. Their cattle pushed her fence line the way they themselves pushed every boundary she set, with persistence and the patient confidence of people who believe that eventually everything yields. She found the break at the southeast corner post, 3 rails down and the post itself leaning at a disheartening angle, and she set her lantern on the ground and crouched to examine it. The post had not been broken. It had been loosened deliberately, the earth around its base disturbed, packed back loosely enough to give the impression of natural erosion. She pressed her fingers into the soil and felt the wrongness of it, the way loose soil feels different from settled soil, and she sat back on her heels and looked out across the dark Texas morning and felt something she had learned to identify precisely. Not fear, something colder than fear. Certainty. The Beaumont brothers had decided to move from suggestion to action. She rode back to the house and sent her one permanent hand, a 60-year-old Mexican man named Delfino Reyes, who had worked the Townsend land since before she was born, into Cassidy to send a telegraph to her solicitor in Abilene. Delfino went without question, because he understood the situation clearly, and because he had watched her father die of heart failure the previous year, and had stayed on out of a loyalty that had nothing to do with wages and everything to do with something Margaret could not name without her throat tightening. She spent the rest of that day repairing the fence herself. She had learned to do most things herself, not because she was proud, although she was, but because the pool of trustworthy labor in Cassidy County in 1878 was shallow, and the wages she could offer were modest, and her situation as a single woman running a cattle operation was unusual enough that men who might otherwise have signed on for a season often decided against it at the last moment, put off by some combination of discomfort and uncertainty that she had stopped trying to analyze. By late afternoon, she had reset the post, rehung the rails, and ridden the full south fence line to check for additional disturbances. She found one more, a section near the creek crossing that had been worked on but not yet opened, and she repaired that too, and by the time she turned her horse toward home the sun was getting low, and the land had gone that particular shade of amber that it turned in the hour before dark, the color that her mother had once called the land's way of apologizing for being so hard. Her mother had died when Margaret was 14. Her father had remarried briefly, unhappily, and the second wife had left after 2 years, unable to reconcile herself to the isolation and the work and the wind that never truly stopped. After that it had been just Margaret and her father and Delfino, running the ranch through drought years and good years and one terrible year when a fever moved through the herd, and they lost 60 animals, and Margaret's father sat down at the supper table one evening and put his face in his hands and wept openly for the first time in her memory. She had put her hand on his shoulder and said, "We are still here, Papa," and they had been. But now she was here alone, and there was a difference between being still here and being alone, and she had made a decision a long time ago not to examine that difference too closely. She was half a mile from the house when she saw him. He was on the road, or what passed for a road in that part of the county, a rutted track that connected Cassidy to the string of ranches that ran northeast toward the Cimarron River. He was on foot, which was unusual enough to make her slow her horse to a walk. A man on foot in the Texas panhandle in October was either in serious trouble or he had made a catastrophic series of decisions. His horse, she realized as she drew closer, was beside him, walking on 3 legs, the left foreleg wrapped in what appeared to be a strip of cloth torn from a shirt. She stopped her horse at a distance and looked at him steadily. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered. Tall and lean in the way that men get lean when they have been working hard and eating irregularly. Not the leanness of sickness, but the leanness of effort. He wore a canvas duster that had seen better years, trail-stained boots, and a hat that sat back on his head in the way of a man who was too tired to care about the angle of it. He had dark hair going slightly wavy at the temples where sweat had dried, and a jaw that suggested he had not been near a razor in approximately 4 days. He stopped when she stopped and looked at her with the direct, undefensive gaze of a man who has nothing to hide and knows it, which immediately made her want to discover what he was hiding. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and steady, with something in it that she placed as West Texas by origin but modified by travel. "Your horse is hurt," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am. She went into a prairie dog hole about 3 miles back. I do not believe the leg is broken, but I do not want to put her weight on it until I know for certain." Margaret looked at the horse. A bay mare, well-built, not young, with intelligent eyes and a calm that suggested she was accustomed to difficulty. The animal was not trembling, which was a good sign. She was not holding the leg entirely off the ground, which was also encouraging. "There's a veterinarian in Cassidy," Margaret said. "That's 7 miles northeast." "I know," he said. "I'm trying to get there." "That will take you until well after dark at that pace." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him for a moment longer. She was assessing him the way she assessed everything, quickly and without sentiment, reading the evidence available. The horse was well cared for, which told her something about the man. His gear was good quality, worn but maintained, which told her something else. He did not appear to be carrying a rifle, though he had a revolver at his hip, a Colt's single-action army by the look of it, and it sat in the holster with the comfort of familiarity rather than the aggressive readiness of a man looking for trouble. "If you bring your horse to my ranch, I have a sound barn and feed," she said. "Delfino can look at the leg. He is better with horses than most veterinarians. In the morning, if she is fit to walk, you can take her to Cassidy." She said it the way she said everything, as a practical arrangement without warmth. She was not offering warmth, she was offering a barn. "I am much obliged," he said. "I'm Emmett Hadley." "Margaret Townsend," she said. "The Townsend ranch is half a mile that direction." She turned her horse and began riding, not looking back to see if he followed, because she had offered and he had accepted, and that was the end of the business of it. He followed. She could hear his boots in the dust and the careful three-legged progress of the bay mare behind her, and she kept her eyes forward and her spine straight, and told herself that she was simply being a decent neighbor, which was what her father had always taught her. No matter what the circumstances, you feed and shelter a man who needs it, because the land is hard enough without people being hard to each other. Delfino was in the yard when they arrived, coming out of the small adobe house where he lived at the edge of the property. He took one look at the horse, and his expression shifted from curiosity to professional attention, and he came forward without being asked, and took the mare's bridle gently, and began running his hands along the injured leg with the practiced lightness of someone who had been doing this for 40 years. "Sprained," he said after a few minutes. "Bad sprain, maybe, but not broken. She needs 2 days of rest and cold compresses and no weight on it." Emmett Hadley looked at his horse with something that was clearly relief, and Margaret saw it and filed it away. A man who felt visible relief when his horse was not seriously injured was a man worth a second look, not romantically. She was very clear about this in her own mind, but in terms of character. "You are welcome to sleep in the barn," she said to Hadley. "I will have Delfino bring you a blanket. In 2 days, when your horse is fit, you can be on your way." "That's more than generous," he said. "It is practical," she said. "I do not have a guest room." She went inside. She made herself supper, a simple affair, dried beans and cornbread, and the last of a jar of preserved plums that she had put up in August. She ate alone at the long oak table, and it tasted like nothing in particular, which was usual, and she went to bed. The next morning she rose at 4:30 and went out to begin the day's work. She was replacing a section of roof on the smaller outbuilding when she heard movement in the barn, and then, after a time, the sound of something she had not heard in quite a while. Someone was chopping wood. She climbed down from the roof and walked around the side of the outbuilding and looked. Emmett Hadley had found her woodpile, which was badly depleted because she had not had time to address it in the past 2 weeks, and he was working through it with the steady, rhythmic competence of a man who had split a great deal of wood in his life. He had removed his duster, and his shirt was rolled to the elbows, and the axe rose and fell with an economy of motion that suggested he was not trying to impress anyone. He was simply splitting wood because there was wood to be split, and he was there, and it was the decent thing. She watched for a moment and then went back to the roof. At midday she came in for water, and he was in the yard, having finished the wood, and moved on to inspecting her water pump, which had been running sluggish for 3 weeks. He had the casing off and was examining the mechanism with focused attention. "If you have a piece of leather about so large," he said, without looking up, holding his fingers apart to indicate a size, "I believe I can fix this. The leather seal has cracked." She went to the small leather working kit she kept in the outbuilding and cut a piece to the dimensions he had indicated and brought it out. He worked for 20 minutes with quiet concentration and then reassembled the pump and pumped the handle, and the water ran clear and strong. "It needed that 2 months ago," she said. "I expect it did," he agreed without judgment. She looked at him then, really looked at him, in the flat midday light that hid nothing. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or 2 older, with deep-set hazel eyes that had the quality of looking at things for what they were rather than what a person wished they were. There was a scar along his left jawline, old and faded, the kind of scar that stops provoking questions because it has been there long enough to become part of a face rather than an interruption of it. He looked like a man who had learned things the hard way and had made a private peace with that process. "You did not have to do any of this," she said. "I know," he said. "You did not have to offer me your barn." That seemed to settle the matter, and they stood there for a moment in the bright October noon, and she was aware of something she had not been aware of in a long time, the particular quality of air between two people who are each deciding whether to trust the other. "Delfino is making beans," she said. "There is enough." He nodded. She went inside. He washed his hands at the pump. They ate at the kitchen table, the three of them, Delfino at one end with the comfortable ease of a man who has eaten at this table for 30 years, Margaret at her place, and Emmett Hadley across from her. The conversation was practical, as conversations over work meals tend to be. Delfino talked about the mayor's progress. Hadley asked about the south fence, because he had noticed her coming in late from that direction the day before, and the soil on her boots had the color of the south pasture. She answered briefly, and then something shifted in the conversation, the way conversations sometimes shift, without any deliberate intention, and she found herself explaining about the Beaumont brothers. She had not intended to do that. She explained about the fence tampering, and about the broader pattern of encroachment that had been building since her father's death. Small aggressions accumulating into a pressure that was consistent with men who had decided that her ownership of 3,000 acres was an arrangement that could be altered given enough patience and nerve. Delfino added a quiet footnote about the time one of the Beaumont hands had ridden onto the property and claimed he was lost, and the particular kind of looking around he had done that had nothing to do with navigation. Emmett Hadley listened to all of this without interruption, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Do you have a solicitor?" "In Abilene. I sent Delfino yesterday to telegraph him." "Good. The key is documentation. Every incident, dated and described in writing, witnessed where possible. If they move to a legal challenge to your title, the documentation becomes the argument. They move to something other than legal challenge." He paused, and the pause carried weight. "Then the documentation is still the argument," she said, "only in a different kind of proceeding." "Exactly." She looked at him. "How do you know about land title challenges?" He met her eyes without flinching. "I worked cattle law in Kansas for 2 years. I am not a lawyer, but I was a ranch foreman who had to deal with the lawyers on both sides of 3 boundary disputes. And what happened in those disputes? 2 of them were resolved in court, in favor of the documented party. 1 of them was not resolved in court." He said this without elaboration, and she did not press him for elaboration, because she understood what the absence of elaboration meant, and she filed that away too. After supper she went out to check on the mare and found that Hadley had already been there, had refreshed the cold compress on the leg, had made sure the animal had water and feed, and had mucked the relevant section of the barn and distributed fresh straw. She stood in the barn doorway and looked at all of this and felt something complicated move through her chest. She went to bed and lay in the dark and thought, in a very controlled and analytical way, that she was not susceptible to sentiment. She had run this ranch alone for 3 years. She had survived drought and cattle fever and the death of her father and the constant low-grade pressure of men who believed she could not or should not continue. She was not the kind of woman who was disrupted by a competent man with good hands and a direct gaze, and she was certainly not the kind of woman who lay awake thinking about the way he had said certain things. She lay awake for 2 hours thinking about the way he had said certain things. The next morning she decided to be very businesslike. She rose at 4:30 and went to the south pasture and checked the fence and came back and was doing the accounts at the kitchen table when Delfino came to the door and told her that the bay mare was walking better and Hadley thought she might be fit to travel in the morning. "Good," Margaret said, and she meant it. She absolutely meant it. That evening Delfino went to his house early, as he sometimes did when the cold settled in his joints, and Margaret went inside to make supper, and Emmett Hadley appeared at the kitchen door and knocked on the frame, because the door was open to let in the last of the day's warmth. "I would like to cook supper," he said, "if you'll allow it. You have fed me twice and I have not done anything to contribute. You fixed the pump." "Yes," he agreed, "but I would like to cook supper." She moved back from the stove and gave him access to it without comment, because she was practical and she was not going to stand in the way of a hot meal on a cold evening out of pride. She sat at the kitchen table with the accounts and watched him, not openly, but in the way that people watch things that interest them while pretending to look at something else. He moved through her kitchen with the ease of a man who cooked for himself regularly, not the ease of someone performing domesticity, but the ease of necessity turned into competence. He found the dried herbs she kept in the tin near the window. He found the jar of lard and the cast iron. He found the venison that Delfino had brought in the previous week, hanging in the cold room, and he brought it in and examined it and cut what he needed with the practiced confidence of someone who understood meat. He made a stew. She would understand later, thinking about it, that it was not the ingredients that were remarkable because they were ordinary ingredients, things she herself had used 100 times. It was something in the way he put them together, the patience of it, the attention. He adjusted the heat 3 times. He tasted it twice and added things both times. He did not rush any of it. She closed the account book when the smell became impossible to ignore, because she could not concentrate on numbers and she had given up pretending to. He set the bowl before her and poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her, and they ate, and it was the best thing she had eaten since her mother had died 14 years ago. She was not exaggerating this, even privately, even in the cautious accountant's ledger of her own mind. It was genuinely, unreasonably good. They talked over supper, not about practical things this time. He asked her how long she had been running the ranch alone, and she told him about her father, and he listened the way he seemed to do everything, with his full attention, without reaching for easy words of comfort. He told her he was heading north, toward Colorado, where he had a possible arrangement to look into with a cattle operation outside of Pueblo. "Possible arrangement," she said. "I will know when I get there whether it becomes an actual arrangement. What did you do before the ranch in Kansas?" "Before that I was with a trail crew, 4 years driving cattle up from South Texas. Before that I was on my father's ranch in Gillespie County." "What happened to your father's ranch?" A pause long enough to be significant. "Debts," he said. "My father was not a careful man with money, not a bad man, just not careful." "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it without any of the reflexive quality that those words often carry. "It was 12 years ago," he said. "I have made my own way since." He asked her about the cattle operation, about her breeding stock, about the grazing rotation she used, and she found herself answering with an openness that she reserved for conversations about things she actually knew, and she knew cattle and land with the intimacy of someone who had grown up alongside them. He asked good questions. He knew enough to ask good questions, which meant he listened to the answers with genuine understanding rather than polite patience. At some point, the candle on the table had burned down by a third, and the stew bowls were empty and neither of them had moved to clear the table. The wind had picked up outside, doing its usual business with the clapboard walls, and the kitchen was warm and the coffee cups were refilled. "I have not had supper worth remembering until this evening," Margaret said. The words came out before she had decided to say them, and she heard them in the air between them and felt the exposure of it, the way a woman standing in a field feels exposure when the wind takes her hat, everything suddenly visible that she had been keeping covered. He looked at her across the table and said nothing for a moment, and in that moment, she saw something move through his expression that she recognized against her will, because she was feeling it herself. Something being acknowledged between 2 people who had both decided a long time ago to stop acknowledging such things. "I am glad of it," he said quietly. She stood up and began to clear the bowls because she needed to do something with her hands, and he stood and helped, and they did not say anything else for a while, And when the kitchen was put to rights, she told him good night, and he told her good night, and she went to her room, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and pressed her hands against her face. "Do not be foolish," she said to herself. "He is leaving in the morning." He did not leave in the morning. This was not because of any design on his part or hers. It was because at 4:30 in the morning, when she went out to check the property in the pre-dawn dark, she found that the south fence had been taken down completely, not just loosened this time, not a subtle tampering, but a full section of 3 rails gone, and the posts pulled from the ground, and 30 of the Beaumont brothers' cattle were standing in her south pasture as though they had always lived there. She stood at the edge of the pasture and looked at the cattle in the lantern light, and felt the cold certainty she had felt at the loose post 3 weeks ago, only larger now, taking up more room inside her chest. This was a deliberate provocation. This was a line being crossed. The Beaumont brothers were done with patience and had moved to direct action, and they would arrive in the morning. She was quite sure of it, claiming that their cattle had strayed through a poorly maintained fence, and that the land her cattle were grazing was a matter of some dispute, and could she show them the survey documents? She turned back to the house and found Emmett Hadley standing in the barn doorway in his duster, having been awakened by the lantern or by some instinct, watching her with a quiet attention. She told him what she had found. She was brief and she was precise, and she did not allow the anger to show in her voice, because anger without control is wasted. "They will come today," he said. "I expect so." He looked at her steadily. "I can stay, if you want another person here when they arrive. You are on your way to Colorado." "Colorado will wait," he said. "The arrangement is not certain. The situation here has more certainty to it." She looked at him in the lantern light and thought about the hidden motives of strangers, which was a thing she had learned to think about carefully. He was a man she had known for 2 days. He had fixed her pump and split her wood and made an extraordinary supper, and he had listened to everything she said with genuine attention. And all of that was consistent with a decent man passing through. It was also consistent with a man who had been sent to earn her trust before doing something with it. She looked at him for a long time. He did not shift or explain himself further, which was what a man trying to sell her something would have done. He simply waited. "Delfino and I will handle it," she said, "but you are welcome to stay until the situation is clearer." "All right," he said. They did not have to wait long. By 9 in the morning 2 riders came up the road from the southwest, and she recognized the Beaumont brothers from the length and arrogance of their approach, the way men approach land they have already decided belongs to them. Jonas Beaumont was 45 and broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had curdled into something harder. Clem Beaumont was 38 and quieter, and in some ways more dangerous because of it. Margaret met them in the yard with Delfino at her side, and the original survey documents for the Townsend ranch in her hand, documents that she had gone to the house to retrieve as soon as she saw the dust rising on the southwest road. She had also, with a deliberateness she did not hide from herself, put on the good dress, the dark blue wool one, not for them but for the impression of solidity that it conveyed. She was a person of substance. She was a person who read survey documents and kept them filed correctly and retrieved them with calm efficiency. She was not a woman to be confused or dislodged. Jonas Beaumont looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has made a plan and arrived to execute it and has not quite accounted for the terrain. "Miss Townsend," he said, touching his hat brim, "I am afraid we have a situation. Our cattle wandered through what appears to be a break in your fence line last night." "Your cattle are standing in my south pasture," she agreed pleasantly. "The fence line was deliberately removed. I have documented the 2 previous incidents of fence tampering, both of which I reported to Sheriff Crane in Cassidy, and both of which are on record at his office." She held up the papers in her hand. "And I have here the original survey documents registered with Cassidy County in 1861, documenting the boundaries of the Townsend Ranch. If you have any questions about those boundaries, I would suggest you direct them to your own solicitor, who can consult with mine in Abilene." Jonas Beaumont looked at the papers and then at her and then, for the first time, at the barn, where Emmett Hadley had appeared in the doorway. Hadley had not approached. He was simply there, leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed, and the particular quality of attention that a man who has handled difficult situations before brings to the act of witnessing one. Something shifted in Jonas Beaumont's expression. Not much, just a recalculation. "Nobody is questioning your documents," he said. "I am glad of it," she said. "When can I expect you to collect your cattle?" They collected their cattle. It took 2 hours, because 30 head of longhorn are not collected quickly, and it was done in the specific silence of men who have discovered that the territory they were moving into is better defended than they had anticipated. When the Beaumont brothers and their cattle had gone back through the replaced section of fence, which Delfino and Hadley had rebuilt with efficient speed while she supervised the collection process, she stood in the yard and let out a breath that she had been holding at approximately 60% capacity all morning. "That was well done," Emmett Hadley said, coming to stand beside her. "It was necessary," she said. "It was well done," he said again simply, and something about the repetition of it without additional qualification made her look sideways at him and find that he was not flattering her. He was just stating a fact. "They will not stop," she said. "No," he agreed. "Men like that do not stop easily, but they also tend to move to easier targets when a target proves genuinely complicated." "I need to hire more hands," she said. She had been thinking this for a year, and the money had been the obstacle, and the money was still the obstacle. "I cannot run this operation alone much longer. The fence repairs, the roof work, the accounting, the cattle management. It is too much for one person and one 60-year-old man, however competent." She had not said this out loud to anyone before. It felt like admitting a wound. "How many would you need?" he asked. "2 more, experienced, trustworthy, which is the harder requirement to meet." He looked across the south pasture and then back at her, and she could see him thinking, turning something over, and she waited. "That arrangement in Colorado," he said. "It was not certain. As I mentioned." "You mentioned that, yes. I am a competent foreman. I know cattle and I know land and I know fence lines and I know what men like the Beaumont brothers do and what stops them. I'm not looking for a permanent situation necessarily. But I am not certain that what I am looking for is in Colorado either." She looked at him and thought about secrets and dark pasts and hidden motives, because she always thought about those things. "Why were you on that road with a lame horse, heading toward Colorado from the direction of South Texas in October?" He met her eyes. "Because I left a situation in South Texas that was not healthy to stay in." "What kind of situation?" "A breath. The kind of breath a man takes when he has decided to tell the truth about something. I was foreman on a ranch outside of Laredo. The owner died. His son took over. The son was running the ranch in ways that I found to be wrong. Not wrong as in bad business, though it was that too. Wrong as in the hands were going to get hurt, and the people on the surrounding properties were going to get hurt, and I was not willing to be the instrument of it." "What did you do?" "I told him that his plan was wrong and I would not be part of it. He told me I could leave or I could find out what happened to people who caused him problems, so I left." "That is a significant thing to leave." "Yes," he said, "it was. Are there consequences to your leaving that might follow you here?" He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. "His name is Victor Prout. He is not a man who forgets. But he is a man who has a great many other things to deal with, and I am one ranch hand who refused to cooperate. I do not believe he will spend significant resources chasing me north." She thought about this carefully. He had answered directly. He had not minimized or hedged in the particular way that men hedge when they are hiding the significant part of the truth. He had said, "There is a risk. It is this specific risk, and I assess it at this level." She could dispute the assessment, but she could not dispute the honesty of the disclosure. "The wages I can offer are modest," she said. "I will pay you $40 a month and your board. I will expect you to take on the foreman's responsibilities for the operation, which means you answer to me, and I will be very clear about what that means. I run this ranch. I make the decisions. You execute them and offer your expertise, and I will listen to your expertise carefully, but the final word is mine. That is exactly how it should work, he said, without any hesitation or qualification, and that was, she realized, the thing that decided her. He moved out of the barn and into the small room attached to the outbuilding that had served as a foreman's quarters before her father's last foreman had left 2 years ago. It had a narrow bed and a window that looked east, and a wood stove that Hadley repaired the same day he moved in, replacing the cracked fire brick with careful efficiency. The first week was all business. He rode the full property line twice, which took most of 2 days, and came back with a written account of every section of fence and its condition, every water source and its state, every piece of infrastructure and what it needed. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and read through it, and they went over it together, and she was grateful for the formality of it. The way a business relationship creates a structure that both people can stand inside. She hired 2 additional hands based on his recommendations, men he had encountered on the road who were known to him from previous cattle work. A man named Russell Crane, who was no relation to the sheriff, and a younger man named Philip Aoki, the son of Japanese immigrants who had settled in Texas 20 years before, and who was 23 years old, and the best horseman Margaret had ever seen. She paid them $35 a month each and put them in the outbuilding's bunkroom, and within a week the ranch had a rhythm to it that felt different from anything it had felt in the 3 years of her lone management. Busier, more purposeful. She told herself this was simply the difference between adequate staff and insufficient staff, which was true, but it was not the complete truth. The complete truth involved supper. It had started with that first meal he had made, and it had continued by degrees into an arrangement that neither of them had formally proposed. He cooked supper 3 evenings a week. She cooked the other evenings. Delfino occasionally contributed dishes from his childhood in Chihuahua, slow-cooked things that filled the kitchen with smells that made even Philip Aoki, who was young and cheerful about most things, go quiet and grateful over his bowl. On the evenings when Hadley cooked, which he did with the same focused competence he brought to everything else, she found herself coming in from the day's work looking forward to it with a transparency she found uncomfortable and did not address. They ate at the long oak table, all of them, and there was conversation, and the conversation ranged widely, from the condition of the herd to the news that came in on Delfino's occasional trips to Cassidy to the kinds of philosophical arguments that arise naturally when people who think are put in regular proximity. Philip Aoki had a wry intelligence and a tendency to ask questions that cut straight to the uncomfortable center of things, which Hadley seemed to appreciate. Russell Crane was quiet and had the settled manner of a man who had thought most things through already and was comfortable with his conclusions. Delfino contributed stories about the land and the history of the region that went back decades, things that no surveyor's document captured, the old names for the creeks, the floods that had been and the droughts that had been, the way the land behaved in cycles that made short human memories look insufficient. Margaret listened to all of it and contributed to all of it and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the long oak table was being used for its intended purpose. She did not say any of this out loud. Toward the end of October, Delfino's hip gave him significant trouble, the kind of trouble that the cold weather accelerated, and Margaret insisted he rest it. He agreed with reluctance and spent 3 days in his adobe house, and Margaret found herself riding the northwest pasture alone with Hadley on a cold Tuesday morning, checking the water troughs and the condition of the cattle there. The morning was clear and very cold, the sky a hard blue and the grass silver with frost, and the longhorns moved in that deliberate morning way of large animals that have their own relationship with the cold, indifferent and ancient. They rode for a while without speaking, which was not uncomfortable. She had discovered that silence with Emmett Hadley was not an absence of connection but a different quality of it, the way two people who understand the same thing can be in the same place without needing to describe it to each other. "You are very good at this," he said, after a long while. She glanced at him. "At what?" "Running this place. Managing the work, managing the people, keeping track of everything at once. Most ranch foremen I have known could not do what you do, and they did not have to do it against the kind of resistance you face." She looked back at the cattle. "My father taught me. He taught you well. He also did not teach me some things," she said, and then was not sure why she said it. "What things?" She thought about how to answer this. "He taught me how to be solitary. He was good at it himself. He taught me how to keep the work between you and the loneliness, so that you are always too busy to notice the loneliness directly." She felt him looking at her from horseback. "He meant it as protection," she continued. "I understand that. The land is isolating and the work is relentless, and if you stop to notice all the time what is missing, you cannot do what needs to be done. But there is a difference between protection," and she stopped. "And what?" His voice was quiet. "And permanent habit," she said. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the frost-silvered grass and the slow-moving cattle and the hard blue sky, and she was aware of the specific vulnerability of having said something true about herself, something she had not said before, and she waited to see what he would do with it. He did not do anything immediately. He rode alongside her for another minute, and then he said, "My father was the same. He worked until there was no room for anything else, and I thought that was how it was supposed to be. I thought a man was the sum of his work. It took me a long time to understand that a man can be more than that, or less, depending on the day." She looked at him then, and he was looking at the distance too, at the same frost and sky and cattle, and there was something in his profile in the cold morning light that made her chest feel strange. A specific awareness of him as a person, not a competent ranch hand, not a useful presence, but a particular person who had particular thoughts and had lost particular things and had made particular choices, and was here now on this cold morning on this hard land, and was not entirely indifferent to where he was. She looked away. In November, the first real cold front came through, and they lost 2 calves, and had to work through 2 nights in a row to keep the most vulnerable animals from freezing, working in the barn with lanterns and heat, and the specific exhausted focus of people who cannot afford to stop. Russell Crane and Philip Ayaki did the heavy lifting, but Margaret and Hadley were there for most of it, and at some point in the deep middle of the second night, they were sitting on adjacent straw bales in the warm lantern light, both of them too tired to do anything but wait to see if the smallest calf would make it. And he reached over without looking and put his hand over hers where it rested on the straw, and she turned her hand over and held his, and neither of them spoke about it or looked at each other. And they sat like that until the calf made it, shaky on its legs but alive, and then they let go and stood up and went back to the work. She lay in her bed that morning, the sun coming up, too tired to sleep properly, and she thought about his hand and the warmth of it and the simplicity of it, and she thought about betrayal, which was what she always thought about when she was on the edge of trusting something. She thought about the specific betrayal of her own sense of herself, the self that had decided 3 years ago that she did not need this and was not looking for this, and had organized her life accordingly. She thought about the hidden motives she could not rule out, because she was a pragmatic woman and pragmatic women do not rule out hidden motives. But she also thought about his hand and the way he had simply put it there, not reaching for anything, not asking for anything, just present. She fell asleep thinking about that. The next evening at supper, he made a soup with dried corn and salt pork and dried chilies, and something else she could not identify that made it extraordinary. And she sat at the long oak table with Delfino and Russell and Philip, and she thought about the words she had said alone in this kitchen 3 weeks ago, and about how that moment of saying them was already beginning to feel like the last moment of something. and how she was not sure if that frightened her or not. After supper, when the others had gone and the kitchen was quiet, she said, "I want to ask you something directly, and I would like a direct answer." He looked up from where he was banking the fire in the kitchen stove. "All right. Why are you here? Not on the ranch, I understand that practically, but why are you still here? The arrangement in Colorado was uncertain, you said, but you did not say there was nothing there. You said it was uncertain. You could find out whether it is certain or not. You are a capable man, and your horse is long since healed. Why are you here?" He closed the stove door and turned to face her and looked at her with that direct, undefensive gaze. "Because I do not want to be anywhere else," he said. The simplicity of it, the absolute simplicity of it. It knocked the air out of her the way a real blow does, not dramatically but functionally, a moment of genuine impact. "That is not a thing to say lightly," she said. "I do not say things lightly," he said. "You know that by now." She did know that. She had been watching him for a month, and she knew that very well. "I am not," she stopped and started again, because she was not a woman who abandoned sentences midway. "I am not easy," she said. "I am difficult, and I am private, and I have built this life a particular way, and I do not know how to dismantle it without losing something essential about who I am." "I am not asking you to dismantle anything," he said. He had not moved from his place by the stove. He was giving her the space of the kitchen. "I am asking for the right to be in the same place as you." She stood at the table and looked at him and thought about every guarded decision she had ever made, and how they had all been correct, and how some of them had also been lonely, and how those two things are not mutually exclusive, correct and lonely. They can be the same choice simultaneously. And she had known this and had chosen correctness over everything else, and she was allowed to continue choosing that. No one was stopping her. She was stopping herself. "I do not know how to do this," she said, and it was the most honest thing she had ever said about herself. "Neither do I," he said. "Not very well. I have been wrong about it before." "What happened before?" It was a woman in Kansas, during the land dispute years. She decided ultimately that a man who moved from situation to situation was not a man who was going to stop moving. She was not wrong. "Are you going to stop moving?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "I have stopped," he said. "I stopped in October when a woman on a horse looked at my injured mare and offered me her barn without warming it with anything other than practicality, and I thought, there is a person worth stopping for." She felt the blood in her face. She was not a woman who blushed easily, and she found the experience disorienting and slightly annoying, and she held his gaze anyway. "I need more time," she said. "I know," he said. "We have it." He went to bed. She sat at the long oak table for a while in the quiet kitchen, and the candle burned, and outside the wind was doing what it always did, and she thought about time which they had and choice which was hers, and she thought about the specific word he had used. Stopped. December came in hard. The range froze solid for a week, and they moved the most vulnerable cattle to the south pasture closer to the creek, and everyone worked long days in the cold. And in the evenings the kitchen was warm, and the supper table was full, and Margaret noticed things she had not been able to notice before. The way Philip Ayaki could make Delfino laugh by imitating the sound of particular cattle. The way Russell Crane read his Bible on quiet evenings with the concentration of someone solving a puzzle. The way Emmett Hadley helped Delfino with his evening meal when the cold had made the older man's hip so stiff he walked sideways, doing it quietly and without drawing attention to it, with the same naturalness that he brought to fixing things that needed fixing. She noticed all of it, and she was part of it, and she thought about the long oak table and its 8 seats, and the fact that it had been built for exactly this, people around it, not fewer people, not one person in the silence. On the 20th of December, 3 letters arrived from Abilene via Cassidy. One was from her solicitor, a formal communication about the documented incidents of fence tampering, which had been received by the county record's office, and which now constituted official documentation that would be relevant in any legal proceeding. One was from an old friend of her father's, a rancher named George Halstead, who was sending Christmas greetings and expressing his admiration for how she had held the ranch together. The third was addressed to Emmett Hadley. She left it on the kitchen table for him and did not look at it, because she was not that kind of person. He came in from the evening work and saw it and picked it up and opened it and read it, standing in the doorway, and she watched his face from across the kitchen, and she was certain something was happening in his expression, and she could not read what. He put the letter in his jacket pocket and came to the table and sat down and said, "It is from Victor Prout." She set down the pan she was holding and turned to face him fully. "He has found out where I am," Hadley said. "He is a more persistent man than I estimated." "What does he say?" "He says that there are matters between us that are not resolved, and that he requires either my return to Laredo to discuss them or my agreement to remain silent about what I know of his operations, and that if I am not willing to do either he will send men to discuss it with me directly." She sat down at the table. "What do you know about his operations?" Hadley looked at her. "He was using his ranch as a staging point for cattle rustling, moving stolen animals north through his property, mixed into his own herds, then selling them in Kansas. Small scale at first, growing. I kept the books for 3 years without knowing what I was looking at. When I understood what I was looking at, I confronted him. And you left. And I left, with the knowledge of what the operations looked like, which is, from his perspective, a liability he wants managed. He would send men here," she said. "It was not a question. He is the kind of man who does what he says he will do. That much I can tell you with certainty." She looked at the table and then at him and then at the letter in his pocket and then at him again. She thought about the words she had used to herself in the early days, hidden motives. She thought about the fact that she had trusted him and that his past had followed him here, which was not exactly a betrayal but was a consequence of trust that she had not been prepared for. "You should have told me this earlier," she said. "Yes," he said without deflection. "I should have. I believed the risk was low. I was wrong. I am sorry." She sat with that for a moment. He was right that he should have told her. He was wrong about the risk level. He had told her the truth when she asked, and he was not asking her to absorb the risk for him, which she could see in his face, the specific look of a man preparing to offer to leave. "If you leave," she said, "does that solve the problem?" "Not entirely. He has made contact. He knows where I have been. If I leave and he sends men anyway, then we face it without the advantage of your knowledge of him," she said. He looked at her and there was something in his face that she had not seen before, something raw and not entirely contained. "We," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "We. You are part of this operation, Emmett. What happens to you here happens to this ranch. That is what it means to have someone working for you." She paused and then added more quietly, "or to have someone." The word hung in the warm kitchen air. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She thought about it properly, because she was not a person who made decisions without thinking them through. "I want to write to my solicitor in Abilene. I want to document that you have received a threatening communication and that you are the holder of information regarding Victor Prout's illegal operations. I want that information filed formally with both the Cassidy County Sheriff and with a federal authority, which means the nearest U.S. Marshal. A man who is threatening a witness to a crime he has committed is in a vulnerable position if that information is widely and officially known." He stared at her. "That is practical," she said. "Yes." "I was going to say brilliant," he said. "It is practical," she repeated, but she felt something warm move through her that she did not examine. They wrote the letters together that evening at the long oak table, she with her clear, confident hand drafting the legal specifics, he providing the details of what he had witnessed in Laredo. It took 2 hours. Delfino went to Cassidy the next morning and sent all of it, and a copy went to the U.S. Marshal's office in Fort Worth. 2 weeks later, they received a reply from the U.S. Marshal's office, indicating that the information regarding Victor Prout's operations was being investigated, and that the communication sent to Emmett Hadley had been noted as potential witness intimidation, and that Mr. Hadley should report any further contact immediately. The threat from Prout, did not entirely disappear overnight. But it became small and manageable and official, the way threats become small when they are dragged into the light of proper authorities and formal documentation, which is a thing that works against men who depend on darkness and uncertainty to maintain their power. On Christmas Eve, Margaret made the supper. It was the best supper she had ever made, a roasted chicken that Delfino had contributed from his small flock, with preserved sweet potatoes and dried apple pie, and a bottle of wine that she had been keeping in the cold room since before her father died, saving it for an occasion she had not been able to specify. She specified it now. They sat around the long oak table, all five of them, Delfino and Russell and Philip and herself and Emmett Hadley, and they ate the Christmas Eve supper, and there was wine and conversation, and Philip Aoki told a story about a Christmas when he was a child, and his father had tried to make a traditional Japanese dish with West Texas ingredients, and the results had been catastrophic but somehow wonderful. Delfino told a story about a Christmas in Chihuahua 50 years ago that was full of people and music, and the smell of wood smoke, and the kind of specific, vivid detail that makes a listener feel they are standing inside the memory. Emmett Hadley told a story about Christmas on his father's ranch in Gillespie County before everything went wrong, a year when they had a full barn and a good harvest, and his mother was still alive, and his father was still careful with money, a year when everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. He told it the way he told everything, without sentimentality but with precision, letting the facts of it carry the weight. Margaret listened and thought about her own mother, and about the Christmas she was 12 and the Christmas she was 14 when her mother was gone and the years since, the diminishing holidays, the table growing quieter until this one, this particular one, which was the loudest it had been in more than a decade, and she thought about her father who would have approved of all of this. She was quite certain, and who had always believed that the table should be full. After supper, after Delfino and Russell and Philip had gone to their respective beds, she and Hadley sat at the table with the last of the wine, and the remains of the candles, and the sound of the wind doing its usual work outside, and she looked at him across the table, and thought that he was the most trustworthy person she had encountered in her adult life, and that this assessment had been earned by 3 months of evidence and was not sentiment, or at least was not only sentiment. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I am afraid of most things that matter," she said. "I am not afraid of the work or the weather or the Beaumont brothers or Victor Prout or any of the practical things. I am afraid of the things that cannot be documented or managed or repaired with a piece of leather and good hands. I am afraid of needing something and not having it. I decided a long time ago not to need things, because a person who does not need things cannot be hurt by not having them." He was very still across the table. "I need this," she said, gesturing at the table at the room at him. "I need this specifically, and I cannot make that not true by ignoring it, which I have tried to do, and I am telling you because you deserve to know, and because not telling you would be a cowardice I am not willing to accept in myself." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the same way he had done in the barn, the same simplicity, and this time she looked at him when he did it, and he was looking at her, and there was nothing hidden in his face, no dark past asserting itself, no secrets, just a man who was exactly where he wanted to be looking at a woman he had decided was worth every mile of difficulty it had taken him to find her. "Margaret," he said. "Yes," she said, and she did not know exactly what she was answering, but it did not matter because the yes was complete and it was true. He stood up and came around the table, and she stood too, and he put his hands on either side of her face, very gently, and looked at her for a moment that was long enough to be a whole conversation, and then he kissed her. And it was the first time she had been kissed in 6 years, and she had forgotten how particular a thing it is, how specific, how nothing about it is general, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat, and it was fast. Which meant that he was not as calm as he appeared, which was the most humanizing thing she had ever learned about him. They stood in the warm kitchen on Christmas Eve in 1878 and held each other, and outside the wind was doing what it always did, and inside the candles were burning down, and the long oak table was covered in the evidence of a full Christmas Eve supper for 5 people, and she thought about the word stopped, and about how still a thing can be and still be alive. January brought the Beaumont brothers one more time, and this time it was different. Jonas Beaumont came alone, without his brother, on a gray Thursday morning, and he stopped his horse at a distance from the house and waited to be acknowledged, which was the body language of a man who has reconsidered his position. Margaret went out to meet him, and Hadley came with her, which Jonas Beaumont noted, and which seemed to have been one of the things he had reconsidered. Jonas Beaumont offered, in language that was careful about never admitting the things it was clearly referencing, to purchase the south section of the Townsend ranch, approximately 500 acres, at a price that was fair, which was his word, fair. He said this as though he were doing her a favor. She looked at him in the gray January morning and said, "No." He adjusted his hat and said that perhaps the price could be discussed. She said that the price was not the issue. He looked at Hadley for a moment, a long and assessing look, and then looked back at her and said that he hoped there were no hard feelings between the neighboring properties. She said that she hoped his fences were in better condition than they had been in the autumn. He rode away. They watched him go. "He will not be back," Hadley said. "No," she agreed. "He won't." She looked at the 500 acres of south pasture that she had refused to sell and thought about her father standing at the fence line of it when she was 8 years old, teaching her to read the grass, to understand what the density and color of it told you about the soil beneath, and she thought about all the mornings she had walked that fence alone in the dark with a lantern, and she was very glad she had said no. February was the month she said yes. Not in those words. It was not that kind of conversation. It was an evening in late February when the worst of the winter had broken and the first suggestion of warmth was in the air, just a suggestion, not a promise, and they were sitting on the porch after supper, which was a thing they had been doing increasingly when the weather allowed, sitting in the 2 wooden chairs that her father had built and looking at the land in the last light. He said, "I have been thinking about whether I want to go to Colorado." She kept her eyes on the horizon. "And I do not want to go to Colorado. You mentioned that in October. I am mentioning it more specifically now." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to stay here." "I want to stay here as something more specific than a foreman." She looked at him. "I want to marry you," he said. "If you are willing, if you believe that is something that makes sense to you. I understand if you need more time. I'm not going anywhere regardless." She looked at him for a long time, looking for the thing she always looked for, the thing she could not quite name, the evidence of motive beyond what was declared, the hidden thing that would make all the declared things false. She found nothing. She had been looking for 5 months and she had found nothing, which was itself a kind of evidence. "It makes sense to me," she said. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat on the porch in the last February light and held hands and looked at the land, the 3,000 acres of hardscrabble Texas panhandle that she had held together by will and work, and the specific pride of a woman who had been told repeatedly that she could not do it, and had decided that opinion was irrelevant. They were married in April. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher who came through Cassidy every 6 weeks, a cheerful man named Reverend Augustus Cole, who had married and buried more people on the Texas Panhandle than anyone could keep accurate count of. The ceremony took place in the yard of the Townsend Ranch on a Sunday afternoon in April when the grass had greened up and the sky was the pale, clear blue of early spring. Delfino stood beside Emmett. Philip Aoki and Russell Crane stood behind them. George Halstead came from his ranch 20 miles away because he had been a friend of her father's and understood what this day meant in the context of the years before it. There were no other guests, because they were not people who had large circles of acquaintance, but the people who were there were the right people, and the ceremony was short and clear, and the words they said to each other were the same words people had always said, and they were sufficient. Margaret wore her dark blue wool dress, and she had done her hair up properly with pins, and she was aware, in the clear spring afternoon, of the specific fullness of the moment, the way it connected backward to all the mornings she had walked the fence alone in the dark, and forward to everything she could not yet see. Emmett Hadley said his vows in a steady voice, and she heard in them what she knew of him, the steadiness that was not stubbornness but was rootedness, the kind of reliability that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from having been through difficulty, and having made a choice about who to be on the other side of it. She said hers, and her voice was steady too. The supper that evening was the best meal the long oak table had ever held, because Delfino and Philip and Russell had conspired to produce it, and it was an extraordinary collaboration. Delfino's slow-cooked beef in red chili, Philip's mother's recipe for rice brought up from somewhere east of their Texas life, Russell's bread that was an art form he never adequately explained, and a bottle of wine that George Halstead had brought from Abilene, and the pie that Margaret had made early that morning, because she was still a woman who did the work that needed doing regardless of the occasion. They sat at the long oak table for hours. Long after the sun had gone down and the candles had burned to stubs, they were still there, talking, and the talk ranged as freely as it always did. And at some point Margaret looked down the table at the faces of the people there, and thought about the word that her father had used for a meal like this, though she had not heard that word applied to anything in a long time: family. Summer came, and the work intensified with the season, and the ranch ran with a competence and efficiency that she had not managed alone. And the difference was not that she was weaker than she had been, but that she was not alone anymore. And those are very different things. The boundary situation with the Beaumont brothers had settled into a permanent indifference that suited everyone. Victor Prout was, according to a letter from the U.S. Marshal's office in June, the subject of an active federal investigation regarding stolen cattle, and the issue of his threatening communication had been absorbed into the larger proceedings, which meant that particular dark past was being addressed through proper channels. In August she told Emmett, sitting at the kitchen table in the early morning before the day's work began, that they were going to have a child. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her, and his face went through several things in quick succession, and then settled into something that she could only describe as utterly undone in the best possible way, the way a person looks when something they had barely allowed themselves to hope for turns out to be true. He reached across the table and took both her hands and held them and said, "Are you well? Do you feel well?" "I feel very well," she said. "I feel entirely well." "Good," he said. "That is the important thing." She looked at him holding her hands and thought that she would remember this morning for a long time, the specific quality of August light through the kitchen window, the coffee cups on the table, his hands on hers. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, as she had suspected it would be, because she was healthy and the work of the ranch kept her body strong, and she was not a woman given to dwelling on difficulty. She continued working through the autumn, adjusting what needed adjusting, letting Emmett absorb more of the physical labor without making a ceremony of it. Their son was born in the first week of April 1880, which meant he arrived exactly 1 year after their wedding, which was a fact that seemed fitting to her in a way she could not entirely articulate. He was born in the house with the assistance of the midwife who came out from Cassidy, a capable woman named Mrs. Holt, who had delivered approximately 300 babies across the county, and who handled the whole proceeding with a brisk efficiency that Margaret found comforting. Emmett named him Thomas, for no reason more complicated than that it was a name he had always liked, and Margaret agreed because it was a solid name, a name that would stand up to the wind and the work and the years. Thomas was a good baby, as babies are sometimes good, not out of any particular virtue on his part, but because he was healthy and curious, and had from the beginning a focused quality to his attention, the way he looked at things, that made Delfino say with great certainty that the boy was going to be a rancher when he grew up, because he was already looking at the world the way a rancher does, trying to understand what is actually there rather than what he hopes is there. Delfino was 63 by then, and his hip had not improved with the cold seasons, and Margaret had begun to think about what the next years would bring for him, and had quietly made arrangements that were consistent with her understanding of what a person owes to someone who has been loyal for 30 years. She had set aside a portion of the cattle profits, and had built a better stove into his adobe house, and had ensured that he was not excluded from the life of the main house. He had Sunday supper with them without fail, sitting at the long oak table, and eating whatever was being made and contributing whatever story seemed to belong to the occasion. In the spring of 1881, a letter came from Philip Aoki's family in South Texas. His father had taken ill. Philip asked, with the careful courtesy of a young man who understood what he was asking, for a leave of absence. Emmett and Margaret agreed immediately, and Philip went south and was gone 2 months and came back with his father recovered, and a quiet new gravity to him that sat well on his 26-year-old shoulders. Russell Crane married a woman from Cassidy in the summer of 1881, a schoolteacher named Clara who had opinions about everything and expressed them without reservation, and who discovered in her first visit to the Townsend ranch that she and Margaret had a great deal in common in this respect, and they became friends of the specific kind that two competent women become in a world that underestimates them, which is to say absolutely and without reservation. The ranch grew through 1881 and 1882. Emmett expanded the herd carefully, culling the weaker animals and improving the breeding stock with 2 bulls purchased from a proven line out of Kansas. They added a second section of outbuilding that provided better shelter for the winter-vulnerable cattle. They drilled a second water well in the north section that improved the grazing rotation and reduced the stress on the creek-adjacent land during dry summers. Margaret kept the accounts with her characteristic precision, and the numbers told a story of steady, hard-won prosperity, the kind that does not arrive in a flood but accumulates like sediment, year by year, season by season, the product of good decisions made consistently by people who are paying attention. Thomas, who had been walking since 10 months and talking since 11 months, and asking questions since approximately the moment he could form sounds into something intelligible, was 2 years old and certain that the horses were his particular responsibility, a belief that everyone on the ranch humored because the horses seemed to share it. In the autumn of 1882, Delfino Reyes died in his sleep peacefully in his adobe house on a cold November night. Margaret found him in the morning when he did not appear for the day's work. She sat with him for a while before she went to tell the others, because she was that kind of person, a person who takes time with important things. She cried in private once, which was her custom, and then went back to work. At the supper table that evening, she told stories about Delfino to the assembled people, because that was what he deserved, and Philip and Russell and Clara and Emmett contributed their own stories, and Thomas, who understood something had happened without understanding the full shape of it, sat quietly at his place with an unusual solemnity that was very much like his mother's. They buried Delfino on the property, at the edge of the south pasture near the creek, because that was where he had always gone to sit in the evenings when his hip was bad, looking at the land in the last light. The grave was marked with a proper stone that Emmett cut himself, and on which he carved Delfino's name and the years, and below that, Margaret added a line in Spanish that Delfino had said to her once about the land. Esta tierra te recuerda aunque tú la olvides. This land remembers you even when you forget it. The winter of 1882 was the hardest since she had taken over the ranch, a sustained cold that lasted from November to late February and tested every system and every person. They lost 12 head of cattle, which was painful but manageable, and they did not lose a person, which was the thing that mattered. By the time March broke with a sudden, almost violent warmth, the kind of warmth that the Texas panhandle saves up all winter and releases in a rush. Margaret was sitting on the porch with her coffee in the early morning, and Thomas was beside her, having woken early and come to find her as he usually did when he woke early, with the specific homing instinct of a child for the parent they trust most. And she held her cup and watched the greening land and felt the warmth on her face, and thought that her father had been right about the land, that after the hardness it apologizes, and the apology is entirely genuine. Emmett came out with his own coffee and sat in the other chair, and Thomas immediately migrated to his father's lap, because he was a sociable and democratic child who distributed his affections freely and without political calculation, and Emmett settled him there, and they all sat in the early March warmth and looked at the land. "Spring," Thomas said, with the solemn authority of a 2-year-old who had just learned the word. "Spring," Emmett agreed. Margaret looked at them both and then looked at the land and thought about all the springs she had not seen from this porch in this way, and was not sad about them, because you cannot be sad about the things you did not yet know how to have. You can only be grateful for the moment when you understand how to have them. She was, specifically and precisely, grateful. In 1883, they hired another hand, a man named Samuel Torres, who came from New Mexico and who had worked cattle for 15 years, and who, like Philip Ayaki, was one of those people whose competence and character were immediately apparent. The ranch had expanded enough by then to need him, the herd having grown to nearly 400 head, the infrastructure having improved to support more animals through the difficult seasons. Philip Ayaki, who was 28 by 1883, had found in himself an interest in the breeding and improvement of cattle stock that exceeded the general interest of a working hand and approached something more like scholarship. He read everything he could find on the subject, sent for pamphlets and publications from agricultural colleges in the East, and began keeping his own records of the herd that complemented and extended Margaret's accounts. It was the beginning of what would become a significant expertise, one that the Townsend Ranch would eventually benefit from considerably as the decade progressed, and the cattle industry in Texas became more competitive and more technical. Margaret discovered she was expecting a second child in the spring of 1883. She told Emmett in the same way she had told him about Thomas, at the kitchen table in the early morning, and he reacted in the same way, with the same profound undoing, which she found, if possible, even more moving the second time, because it confirmed that the first time had not been performance. Their daughter was born in December of 1883, which put her arrival in the deep cold, which Emmett said was appropriate because she came into the world with a voice that would carry across a winter pasture. They named her Catherine, for no particular person but for the quality of the name, which was strong and clear and unpretentious. Thomas, who was 3 years old when Catherine arrived, received this development with a mixture of fascination and territorial concern that sorted itself out over the course of several weeks into a devoted protectiveness that would characterize their relationship for as long as anyone could see. He was the first to show her the horses. He was the first to explain to her, in his 3-year-old's confident authority, how the fence worked and why it mattered. The long oak table in the winters when everyone was in the house for the evening meal had 8 people around it, exactly 8 people. The table her father had hauled across 3 states for a family of 8 was being used for the purpose it had always been built for, and sometimes in the evenings after supper, when the dishes were done and Catherine was asleep and Thomas was nearly so, Margaret put her hand flat on the surface of that table and felt the grain of the oak under her palm and thought about her father, and thought about the word her mother had used for the evening sky over the Texas panhandle: an apology. The land's apology for being so hard. But sitting in her kitchen with the stove warm and the lamps lit and Emmett at the table reading the cattle records Philip had compiled, and the sound of the children's breathing from the next room, she thought that maybe the land was not apologizing. Maybe the color was something else. Maybe it was the land showing you, briefly, what all the hardness was for. She poured herself coffee and sat across from her husband, and thought that she had not had supper worth remembering until the evening. A tired man with a lame horse had walked up her road, and she had offered him her barn without warming the offer with anything other than practicality. She thought about the words she had said to herself alone at the table that night, and how she had said them in terror, and how the terror had been accurate. Because things that are worth being afraid of are worth having, that is the truth of it, the terrible and complete truth. She had been afraid, and she had been right to be afraid, and she had done it anyway. Not in one moment, not in a dramatic declaration, but in the accumulation of days, in the hand held in the barn and the vows said in the April yard, and the son born in the spring and the daughter born in the winter, and the fence repaired, and the pump fixed, and the long oak table used the way it was supposed to be used. She had done it anyway. "What are you thinking about?" Emmett asked without looking up from the records. "Supper," she said. He looked up then and looked at her and smiled, and it was the kind of smile that takes years to earn, not from a person but from a life, the kind of smile that is the result of enough accumulated days of trust that a person no longer has to think about whether to give it. "It was a good one," he said. "It always is," she said. Now. Outside, the wind was doing what it always did, pushing hard against the clapboard walls, testing every nail, every joint, every commitment the house had ever made to standing upright. The house stood. The candles burned. The stove radiated its steady warmth. The cattle moved through the dark outside in that ancient way of large animals, slow and certain. The children breathed in the next room. Emmett went back to the records, and she went back to her coffee, and the night went on, ordinary and complete, the way the best nights always are, not remarkable in the way that disasters are remarkable, but remarkable in the way that being alive and not alone is remarkable, which is to say quietly and thoroughly, and without any need to say so. Though she said so once more very quietly to herself, and to no one, and to everyone who had been at that table, and to her father who had built the table, and to the land outside that kept its ancient, indifferent vigil. "I have not had supper worth remembering until this evening, and every evening since, and every one to come.